Hello everyone, it is Joe here from OmniPoke, the channel that brings you guys everything Pokemon. If you're looking for PTCG live codes, make sure you check out the Potown store. You can get a 5% discount on your orders using that code OmniPoke. For today's video, we're going to be looking over the NAIC results, the first tournament that we had in the West, which had the Twilight Masquerade cards legal. It was a 2,692 player tournament, making it the largest Western event of all time. I've come back from casting the tournament myself alongside the Wassy, long-time casting duo that we've had, although we have been split up for a number of tournaments as well. But yeah, great to be working alongside him and alongside Pablo and Boo and Juancho and even Jeremy, who was kind of backstage and you weren't seeing him too much. Great to chat with all those guys and see them in action, of course. And we were really spoilt with games that we had throughout the entire tournament, so if you haven't seen all the games, I do implore you to check those out. Let's first jump to the overall meta that we saw at the NAIC, starting with the day one usage, and Lugia was out in front at almost 18% in terms of popularity. It was, of course, coming off the huge domination that we saw at the Japan Championships, where it was 4 of the top 8 decks, so it's not surprising to see just how popular that archetype was. Raging Bolt and Gardevoir EX also quite popular picks, Raging Bolt being the new easy-to-play aggressive archetype, very good in 50-minute best of 3 with high power level at its disposal, so long as it's facing multi-prize matchups. And Gardevoir was still always expected to be strong. It was one of the best performers in the online spaces. The deck was picked up on average by very, very high-level players, so it seemed like a lot of them had a similar idea in that Gardevoir was the play for this tournament. There was a decent chunk of Lost Zone, a big drop down really from our top 3 in terms of popularity, with just the almost 9% of the Lost Zone box. Dragapult EX was split up on our data, so actually it would have been more popular than Lost Zone box if you combine the Draga EX decks that you can see here, the 5.68%, but also on the best of the rest in a moment, you'll see there's also 119 of the Lost Zone builds of Dragapult. So I think it was still under 10% for Dragapult, but still sort of underrepresented from what I was expecting. So I think this percentage would have been just alongside the Pidgeot, maybe some with the Xatu and some with Charizard as well. I'm not quite sure how Arcanine sort of collated the data, but those were the overall Dragapult decks. Do bear in mind, though, I know this from personal experience, that some of the Regidragos were registered within the percentage of Dragapult EX as well, because when I was looking at standings, I could see that there were some Regidrago players that we'll look at in a moment that actually came under Dragapult EX, so I think there was a hot search for exactly Dragapult EX within deck lists, and then being labelled as Dragapult, whereas there was no search for Regidrago V-Star. So that was kind of a random interesting thing. When we look at the overall percentage, possibly Dragapult was even less popular than we thought, because some of those were actually Drago decks that featured Dragapult. So that's a small nuance there between the percentages of the meta data. If you're sort of thinking of just how badly Dragapult flopped, it also wasn't all that popular, to be honest with you, so just a small thing to bear in mind there. And then Miraidon EX made it into our day one graphic. I think this was sort of in the build up to the tournament with the expectation of Lugia being all that powerful and the expectation of Gardevoir being really strong, so this was actually kind of a nuanced pick, which I imagine some people jumped onto in the last minute. Players like Ian Robb, who I wouldn't associate with playing Miraidon, would have most likely chosen this deck as a sort of late game meta call. If you can fix the Raging Bolt matchup or just try and dodge a number of them, Miraidon is still a really powerful archetype. Then we get to the best of the rest, some of the really interesting stuff here. Charizard and Chien-Pao, decks that you would always put on the day one field of the Temporal Forces meta, have dipped down to the sort of best of the rest in our Twilight Masquerade, so they seem to be less safe, less easy to play archetypes in this metagame. Charizard a little bit concerned by Dragapult, also having to be aware of cards like Cornerstone Ogerpon, be aware of Iron Thorns, be aware of the control matchup still, so having to spread itself quite thin, and even just the threat of Cleffa being a way worse card when there's Gardevoir around, as well as Dragapult, as well as Sableye at full force. I imagine the Charizards wouldn't have the space for Jirachi, so yeah, Charizard a little bit less of an easy play. There is that chunk of Dragapult with Lost Zone as well. Interestingly, if you followed towards Masterclass, the Lost Zone Pult was the deck that he focused on the most, so that may have also influenced the overall meta around this deck in particular, because it was the one that Todd sort of deep dived the most into. And then we have Future Box as well as Ancient Box. Ancient Box actually seemed like a low-key, pretty solid play, as long as you could navigate the Lugia matchup. I feel like its others matchups in the field are pretty strong, so I would expect that Ancient Box going into the World Championships is one of those sort of better poised archetypes, because it's one of the ones that can deal with Gardevoir the best, although it is still very subject to unfair stamp and can crumble if it gets aggressive too early in the game. And the control really falling off the map, just that 2.1%, one of the lowest we've seen for a while. while, and even less so for Pidgeot Control, which was doing really well in Temporal Forces. Felt like there was just too much headache for that archetype going into a new format where there was the threat of Lugia V-Star at such a high priority. Looking at our day 1 to day 2 conversion, Gardevoir easily the big winner, jumps way up to 21%. Archeops and Raging Bolt both losing a little bit of ground, Lost Box doing pretty well, Miraidon doing slightly better than its overall day 1, and then Dragapult also having a small dip, but really not a huge deal there. I think it's easy to see, based on just the other decks that are around Raging Bolt, why it wasn't all that successful, and it's possible that Lugia Archeops was just once again overrated as an archetype going into this format. It obviously has that power level, but at the end of the day, it is still an inconsistent pile of cards that sometimes will just wreck you, and when you're playing this many games of Pokemon, it's inevitable that you will pick up losses and ties with this archetype no matter what you come up against, just because your own deck isn't working till like turn 3 or 4. And then for the best of the rest, Charizard and Chien-Pao basically stayed where they are. Dragapult lost a little bit of ground. It was actually the Future Hands which fell off the graphic, and Giratina sort of snuck in. Giratina, one of these sort of tried and trusted archetypes, so I imagine pilots of the Giratina deck were just very experienced with them, and that's always going to help you get to a 6-2-1 record. With the metagame broken down, let's start looking at some deck lists. Let's congratulate first Andrew Hedrick, our new NAIC champion, already a 3-time regional winner and now an IC champion, a very short space of time. Andrew is proving that he is a very, very good player. Kind of burst onto the scene over the last few years, but really is making a name for himself and a claim to be one of the strongest players that we just currently have in the game, period. And he played a very aggressive Lost Zone box archetype, featuring 4 copies of Pokestop and 3 Lost Vacuum, foregoing the Raikou Forest Seal Stone that has been the trend as of late, instead just going for the highest count possible of all the important item cards, including, 4 switch cards, which aren't always in the list, because people have stripped away those counts traditionally. Also, reduce down the Pokemon count, adding in the new Blood Moon Ursaluna EX, which is obviously a very powerful late game beat stick that doesn't require Mirage Gate. Obviously the Iron Hand's a crucial card as well, so you can amp you very much, but the new Iron Thorns EX was an interesting tech inclusion, which is not only good against the Lugias, which is probably its main function, but every now and then, because the Gardevoir is trying to attack with Fluttermane so much, you will knock out Fluttermanes and then turn off the use of Gardevoir EX as well, so that can put a spanner in the works for some Guardy players, which is kind of interesting, because there will be spots where you have to take a single prize knockout, and this can be a really annoying card for them to deal with at times if they haven't preloaded certain Pokemon. So that's actually low-key not a bad option, especially because by them gusting away the Iron Thorns, they're only ever taking like a 1 prize knockout typically, so that's actually pretty handy as well for you. So the Thorns actually proved to be a really nice secondary lightning type for the deck. Obviously a lot of respect given to Lugia at the time as well. Fluttermane wasn't all that popular in Lugia. It was very popular over in Japanese lists, but wasn't always taken on by the West, because Thorns wasn't all that popular of an archetype, and I think the logic was that if Thorns is showing up, it's mostly going to be in Miraidon and Future Box anyway, which are already really bad matchups for Lugia, but a number of players actually chose to add it into Lost Zone Box. It was actually a very cute choice as well. Ultimately, this fast 7 approach seemed to be really, really helpful for Andrew throughout the entire weekend. It meant that rather than going for early Cramorant pressure and just sort of falling short against Unfair Stamp very early, Andrew would wait until he hit the 7 break point and either use Greninja to completely annihilate a board, or to use Iron Hands to take multiple prize knockouts whilst also gating to other targets around your bench, so that even if you are getting hit to a lower hand size, you at least have like Comfey Pivot ready, at least have Greninja on board, this, that, and the other. So yeah, and also by having like Pokestop in play as well, that's somewhat of a defense card as well. So it left you with something on board all the time, so that even if you were getting hit down to low hand sizes, you could typically recover from it as well. So yeah, really well constructed deck list from Hedrick, and we know he's a busted in-game player. Just look at the finals and some of the other games that he had to navigate throughout the tournament. It was cracked. Also, just a quick note on the list, a few other pilots also making day 2s and whatnot with it. So yeah, seemed to be a successful deck list. Looking ahead to the World Championships, there is of course the new Kyurem, which could be a tech card for the Lost Zone. I figured before NAIC this Kyurem wasn't going to see a huge amount of play, but now with Lost Box right back in the spotlight, possibly that is going to be more of a tech card that you have to dodge and weave, similar to Spiritomb with Mew in the last year's World Championships. So that'll be an interesting dynamic to be following. Also, because of mirror matches now, it's possible that you might have to add in Manaphy as well, so bear those things in mind. The other Lost Box in top 8 was Andrew Gantner, very similar 60. You can see also a number of players playing pretty similar lists here as well, taking a very similar approach, to be honest with you, where it's incorporated the 3 copies of Pokestop and the 3 Vacuum Vacuum. I think it's only really 1 or 2 cards different. It's playing a second copy of the Poker Gear instead of one of the switches, and it's playing a Manaphy in the deck list, which Hedrick chose not to play. But outside of that, it's the exact same sort of concept, so all the same props to Gantner for having a great run. Next up, we have the sort of main story of the tournament, which is the domination of Gardevoir. Stefan Ivanov made it to another finals of NAIC, almost making it 3 wins for this tournament. He really enjoys playing out in the US, and he piloted a pretty interesting build of Gardevoir EX. It incorporated the Hyper Aroma as the A-spec, and there was 2 of the Hyper Aroma in the top 8, so it definitely does show that because Gardevoir takes so long to win its games, that you need to have a game plan for when you do go first and when you do go second. There's no doubt the Unfair Stamp is the stronger card of the 2, but just because you're in best of 350 minutes and you cannot lose a game of Gardevoir, otherwise you're going to tie or lose that series, having Hyper Aroma means that when you go second, you can at least still construct a really good board and just refine throughout the entire game. So this is like the safer choice of A-spec, I suppose, because it means that you're just getting on the board as often as possible. So that is a thing that I did just want to shout out, and I did think it was pretty reasonable. It also seems like there was a lot of respect from Stefan to beat the Lugia matchup by having the E-Hammer as an Arven searchable option, but also having the Temple of Sinnoh in the decklist rather than just picking one of the 2. And that definitely paid off because Lugia was the most popular archetype in day 1 of the tournament, and it seemed like everyone was prepared for Lugia at this tournament. We're going to see over and over again there are going to be a lot of techs against that matchup, so it does feel like a valuable card, even if they felt like bulk throughout the rest of day 2, because Lugia didn't do all that well throughout the weekend. The other kind of notable cards is choosing to play 1 copy of Klefki in addition to Fluttermane. There are going to be some lists that play double Flutter, but the Klefki being that sort of more serious lockdown on basic Pokemon is a pretty big deal. And again, we saw Stefan use this to great effect in the finals, although it was the thing that shut off his own Manaphy, which ended up being his downfall as well. So possibly a debate around playing a second copy of Flutter rather than playing the Klefki itself, but something that I'm just sort of musing on right now rather than being necessarily a bad take for the tournament. Next up, we have Kato's 60, very similar to the Japanese Championships list that did pretty well, where it's chosen to cut the Radiant Greninja from the deck list in favour of Tatsugiri, and it's going for double Monkey Dory alongside the 2 Darkness Energy. I think Monkey Dory was honestly the star of the show throughout the NAIC. I know I'm personally biased towards this card, of course, but just seeing how often the Adrenabrain ability could change the math or allow you to hit something and wait for next turn to take a crucial knockout in addition to something else over there, always pressurizing evolving and low hit point Pokemon throughout the entire game, it really made me think that Monkey Dory is an insanely strong selling point for Gardevoir, and it feels like Kato was right on the money with this list as well. In order to kind of supplement the option of the Monkey Dory in the 2 count is the 3rd copy of the Earthen Vessel, which I thought was pretty intriguing, and in this deck list it's the Unfair Stamp, which is ultimately the more commonly occurring top 8 A-spec, so it's really up to you whether you want to have this huge power spike card versus the Hyper Aroma, which is often less flashy of an A-spec in terms of an instant game winner that kind of just gets you into more games in the first place. The other top 4 list was from Kaiwin Kababe, but we also had Natalie Miller in top 8 with it, and Brent Tonneson in 9th place, and even James Cox in the top 32. So the Aussie 60 really was a phenomenal one. There were some great things to shout out here. The TM Devolution, definitely a big inclusion. It's not the only time we'll see this card in the top 8 either, so it definitely seems like a strong tech card, especially if we're expecting even more Gardevoir going ahead. Also worth noting that the Aussies went for double Artisan and just had E-Hammer rather than the Temple of Sinnoh. The E-Hammer is like less of a powerful card, but it's obviously way more searchable against the Lugia matchup, so something to note there where you just don't whiff it when you need it. Sebastian Lashmet also had a good run incorporating the Sinnoh this time around rather than the E-Hammer, so both are kind of doing pretty well, and the Klefki was once again incorporated into this list, but interestingly enough, no Fluttermane, and I think Flutter was absolutely busted whenever I was casting the Gardevoir games, so it would be a card that I'd definitely try and work into the 60. It seems way too good not to play for me. Has amazing synergy with your Monkey Dory, and it's honestly one of your better defenses against Lost Box, which is only upticking right now. Next up we have Henry Chow, who was top of the standings throughout our Swiss rounds, who played a really interesting 60 actually, incorporating the 1 copy of Irida and still having 3 copies of Arven, incorporating the TM Devo, and rather than any Bravery Charm or Drifloon whatsoever, just going for the heavier Flutter, heavy Monkey Dory with 3 Dark Energy, and having the Lutz Cape essentially just as a finishing option with Screamtail, with that huge roaring scream that could even deal damage into the active position when required. Henry also had the Hyper Aroma in the deck list, so again is sort of leaning towards just being consistent throughout every single game you play with the deck. There's also the Mimikyu in this deck list, so Henry really was on a mad one with so many tech inclusions here. Outside of our top 8 then, there was a Snorlax that was in 10th place, obviously incorporating the accompanying flutes, had the Handy Fan, had the 4 Temple of Sinnoh and 1 Giacomo in the decklist, so there was some respect being given to the Lugia matchup, but it seemed like Henry overall benefited from the lack of success from Lugia throughout this tournament, so something that I sort of have my eye on for the World Championships. If Lugia is on that sort of downtrend after the sort of wave of hype kind of flopped at the NAIC, possibly the controlling decks are more well positioned going into the World Championships. Mike Gibbs got top 16 with a really interesting Miraidon 60 where it's only playing 4 Arven, 4 Boss. Typically, you see a decent amount of research, sometimes even Ino in the list as well, but this list is trying to be just very aggressive on those ball search options. The double Squawk ability really highlights that, the fact that you want to just dig with Squawk and Seas and then use Arven to cherry pick some other pieces that you're lacking, try and utilize that Forest on turn 1 with that Raikou. And Mike has really even just reduced down a lot of his attacking options, not even having the Raichu V in the deck list. So your damage output really is capped with the deck list, but it's all in on just having maximum tempo turns, with your sort of mid-game draw mostly coming from the form of Mew-EX and Radiant Greninja, alongside having those Boss and Arven throughout the game as well. I think it's fair to say that Raging Bot Ogerpon didn't have a fantastic conversion from day 1 to day 2, but it did still make a top 16 placement from Brandon Salazar, with a catcher-based build that also incorporated quad trekking shoes, just fitting in the 1 copy of Ino and 1 Boss's Orders, and going for a really healthy, heavy item package in the list. It's cool to note the Sandy Shocks EX that made it into the 60 being a decent onboard Pokemon that can kind of just sit there for when you are going to those lower hand sizes, knowing that even when 1 Raging Bolt is KO'd, you typically have 2 other ancient Pokemon on your bench in another Raging Bolt and a Sandy Shocks, so you still can Sada 2 energy to the next 2 Pokemon, even when your bolts are getting knocked out turn by turn, and of course the Sandy Shocks is a free 70 damage as you go. Jacob I also impressed with the Regidrago Ogerpon list. This is actually kind of interesting that this is the best performing way that we saw Dragapult see success. It's in the form of this stage 1 Pokemon, and this is just like a featuring attacker essentially, where we have the Dragapult and the Goodra, both very strong for like evolving low hit point attacking decks. We have the Raging Bolt for that high damage output option that we can copy with Apex Dragon, and there's also the Noivern EX in here, possibly to help out against Raging Bolt. Interestingly, the only single prize Pokemon is the Cleffa, which is a free retreat pivot, as is the Mew-EX, and I do think that's quite important to have in the deck list, especially when we're only playing 1 copy of Switch, 1 Prime Catcher, and 1 Penny for our mobility. The other sort of main standout I see from the list is going for superior energy retrieval rather than just regular energy retrieval. Playing these superiors just gives you extra discard synergy with your dragons that you want to be throwing away, and admittedly, when a Regidrago V-Star does go down, you're always losing 3 energy, so you can superior, get 4 back, make sure you're getting Teal Dances, and always have your Fire Energy as a backup. It also seems really strange to have no Radiant in the deck list. Radiant Charizard would have easy synergy here, and even Radiant Alakazam would have decent synergy if you're leaning into that God of White EX in a number of matchups, so that's something I'm going to try and work into a list of my own. We have Nick Moffat in at 17th and a number of other Chempals that actually did quite well throughout the tournament. Not too many changes within the 60, just sort of good old Chempal things, but it's cool to see that this deck is still definitely a relevant one in the format, and I think benefiting from the overall lack of Dragapult in the field, because that was one of the main sort of fear factor matchups for Chempal coming into this tournament. So to see the top tables mostly littered with Gardevoir and Lost Zone box meant Chempal was in a fairly comfortable metagame position. So after Tord made his masterclass all about Dragapult, he did end up pulling the trigger on this archetype, although it is mostly a Charizard deck featuring the Pult, but having an important 2-1-1 line in here. Dracloak offering a sneaky extra bit of draw power as you slow evolve, but also having the Dragapult EX, which can set up Charizard really nicely. I think the counts are pretty interesting within the 60. The intent with this list certainly is to go earlier with your Charizard EX and look to weave in a Dragapult if possible throughout the game, giving your opponent a strange sort of bait situation of is it worth me taking out a Droopy or a Dracloak versus taking out a Bibarel or a Pidgeot, knowing that Dragapult EX can provide a lot of value with that Phantom Dive, all the while Tord is kind of just swinging with Charizard, which we know is a super efficient attacker. If ever Dragapult is able to make it into play, the Phantom Dive can set up late game Burning Darkness as well as take out lower hit point threats throughout the game. Not that I want to give away everything from Tord's masterclass, but one of the key takeaways was a 5-card package of Unfair Stamp, Double Counter Catcher, Sinnoh, and Radzard being one of his secrets to success in this format was certainly employed here, and we can see that approach copied and pasted into all sorts of Dragapult lists, so it's something that I want to follow going forward. One card that I'm very skeptical of in this format is still that Cleffa. I think that 30 hit points, especially with the amount of Gardevoir that's going around now, is such a liability. I would definitely try and work in a Tatsugiri instead, or simply free up that space place to be an extra Ino or even a second Drakloak. Alex Szymanski was actually our highest placing Lugia, and it's not what you expect at all. It's an all basic attacking 60, where we have cut Cinccino entirely. Instead, we have the type coverage attacker of Drapion V, which was hilarious to see. 2 copies of Iron Hands to really go in on the Amp You Very Much side of the deck as quickly as possible, alongside 2 Lightning Energy, 1 Vessel, and of course the Legacy Energy still in the list. And we even saw the higher damage output option of Weird Ear V. I think the biggest takeaway from this list is the lean into double Iron Hands, and even having a Thornton in the list is actually quite similar to Hedrick's approach of having a fast 7 in the Lost Zone just to get amping as quickly as possible. This Lugia is trying to amp into a ton of matchups, and I do think that's still going to be really relevant with Gardevoir upticking at the moment. The list still hinges on getting that summoning start off, but you have opened up a number of slots in the deck list by cutting those Cinccino. That being said, those slots haven't really converted into many additional consistency slots from Alex, so it feels like you're still having the same old issues with Lugia. Ethan Ribble was the highest placing Charizard Pidgeot player in at top 32. Some cool things to take away here: the cancelling Cologne to give yourself some respect against the Cornerstone Ogapon, which I imagine is the main reason why it's in the deck list, but it could also give you some utility into Iron Thorns, which I thought was kind of interesting. Also worth noting that the Unfair Stamp, the double counter catcher, the Radzard, and in this case it wasn't the Sinnoh, it was actually the Enhanced Hammer that came into the deck list, but that same 5-card combo can be replicated in a regular Charizard Pidgeot that Todd was mentioning alongside Dragapult. This was a really cool list to see, and a lot of my UK friends also went for a similar deck list, and I heard their discussion throughout, and I feel like Charizard Pidgeot is kind of an underplayed deck in this format. Andrew Kennett made top 64 with a pretty interesting build of Roaring Moon Ancient Box, where we had the Quad Flutter, the Quad Roaring Moon, and the new Walking Wake as just a single retreat cost, higher hit point ancient Pokemon than our previous options in Screamtail, with possibly the big standout card being a shift away from Awakening Drum to the Secret Box instead. Secret Box discards 3 cards from your hand, so it's a great way to just fuel your discard pile with ancient cards, and it can cherry pick your stadium, which there are 2 different options in here, so it gives you extra early game ball search and consistency if you need to, or just a deeper dig with Pokestop. It gets you Sada, which is obviously the main part about the archetype, or Boss when you are getting towards the later game stages, and sort of allowed Andrew to have more of a smorgasbord of supporters in those one-offs of Research and Penny, especially with Palpad, knowing that even in the sort of mid-game you can still Secret Box for the right one at the right time, whilst also accessing an Ancient Booster, which again can be just more fodder or more hit point buff, and one of your many item cards, including the Counter Catcher, which is a big card in the list as well. Even though it's lowering your Ancient card count in total, I do feel like the Secret Box makes enough sense in the Ancient archetype to be the right choice. Especially in a build like this, where we're not going to be benching things like Koraidon as an attacking option, we're just going to have a couple of Roaring Moon and hope to chain those as much as possible. It feels like when you're playing a Walking Wake option, you're just binning those immediately, so you're drawing less cards with the drum regardless. Also want to do a few shout outs to the juniors and seniors. Jose Cruz with a very aggressive Raging Bolt getting the win in the junior division, including 3 copies of the Pokemon Catcher. Edison playing the Goldengo with Palkia, which I know a number of high profile masters also chose to. This one did play the Enhanced Hammer, which seems like a really good irritable searchable answer to the Lugia matchup to give you some help there. And I think the most interesting was actually the top 8 from Ezra here with the Cloth Brute Bonnet archetype. The reason why I want to mention this one in particular is that there is the Binding Mochi tool coming out, which could really improve Cloth's damage output later down the line, so that could be a huge buff to Cloth going forward. Possibly even the new Colrus could be good in a Cloth deck as well, where you can guarantee those searches for the double turbo energy. The secondary attacker of the deck list was actually Cramorant, so there are 4 Colrus and 4 Lost Vacuum without any Comfey whatsoever in the deck list, so you can try and get that fast 4, so you can initiate many matches with a Spit and Instantly play, because it does lead into the Unhinged Scissors quite effectively. And then for the seniors division, Dragapult did actually come away with a win from Nathan Osterkatz with a Dragapult Pidgeot version, with that Neo Upper Energy as the obvious A-Spec inclusion, Mela of course being a decent supporter as well to supplement your Dragapult, so it does prove that this can be a powerful archetype. It did also choose to play the 1-1 Big Barrel package, similar to Andrew Mahone's tweets from a few weeks before the NAIC, but tweaked here and there. Once again, it's incorporating the Sinnoh Double Countercatcher Radzard package, but of course has to play the Neo Upper, so can't play Unfair Stamp. But it's really interesting to see that this copy-paste of sort of this big package of cards that can target a huge range of the format is showing up time and time again. Daniel got second in seniors and showed off just how good Secret Box can actually be in the controlling archetype. Having that opportunity to Arven for this card and bank it in that hand is really fantastic, so that you can react to what your opponent does before searching out the next supporter card that you require, because you play such low counts of these cards. It gives you more immediate access to Temple in one of your worst matchups in Lugia, and it can even help grab those those item cards, and of course those really important tool cards throughout the deck. So even though you are losing out on the Hero's Cape, it honestly seems like it could be the biggest upgrade. So I want to try out Snorlax all over again with that secret box included in the list. It was so strong that there were situations where it was being silenced back on top of the deck for Daniel just to give himself some Iono protection. So that pretty much wraps up everything important about the NAIC. This was the only tournament that we really need to care about the Brilliant Stars to Twilight Masquerade meta. So myself and Jack will be trying to turn our attention to Shrouded Fable quite quickly. So we are going to be on top of things for the World Championships. Yeah, I think this was a really interesting tournament. To have a one and done format is really cool. And it seems pretty clear that Gardevoir is now going to shift into the role of being top dog going into the Worlds format. Lugia certainly dropping down, Raging Bolt dropping down in popularity, and the new aggressive builds of Lost Box also being heavy on that radar. Let me know what you think that immediately changes for our format over the next couple of weeks, and we're going to start turning our attention to Worlds. So myself and Jack are going to be playing with a new set pretty soon. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you tomorrow for another one. Cheers.